Hello, friends. Thank you for joining today's webinar. There we go. Communicating OA and climate ocean change, which will include a panel discussion with practitioners from regional to local scales. As many of you know, my name is Jessie Turner, and I am the director of the OA Alliance, or the International Alliance to Combat Ocean Acidification. Just go ahead and get started here. And it is great to welcome you today and kick things off. To be back together in 2023 and so appreciate this community's ongoing leadership in advancing climate ocean change understanding alongside the messages and the products and calls to action that are increasingly needed to respond. And so today's webinar is going to be a little bit non-traditional in that we are going to share some learnings and takeaways from our work working with governments and non-science partners around this issue. And we also have the pleasure of hearing from Juliana Correales, who is the design and comms lead for the OA Alliance, who's going to draw on her experience working with us, as well as discussions from the 5th International Marine Science Communication Conference, which occurred last year. And this discussion is really going to focus on communicating action taking on ocean acidification and the various ways that the Alliance has engaged our members to help us define what is needed in order to do this and to take up calls for action. Because we know that in order to accomplish our goals and be effective, it's important that members of the Alliance have a really strong sense of the discrete outcomes that they want to be achieving through OA action and communications. So we'll go ahead and get going. So I'll begin with one of my favorite slides from Dr. Carol Turley at Plymouth Marine Lab. And as Dr. Turley has often shared in presentations, in 2003, Googling the words ocean acidification produced 17 hits total. In 2014, it produced nearly 2 million, and then in 2019, nearly 8 million. So we can see that over the past decade, the OA global community has been very successful in raising awareness about ocean acidification and its potential impacts to marine life and resources that humans depend on. And as interest and awareness grows, we must be thinking about communicating OA for different audiences and discrete outcomes. And really what that means is moving from describing what is ocean acidification and why does it matter to what can different actors do to address it. Or put another way, we are really ready to be moving from raising awareness to behavior change. However, to effectuate behavior change, we need to communicate what outcomes OA information can help society deliver. And as a deputy in New Zealand's Ministry of Foreign Affairs said at COP26, OA has now moved from a technical problem to a policy problem. And while acceleration of an investment in the technical capacity building and the monitoring has to remain a critical priority, we're increasingly being faced with new questions for advancing OA policy and action. And so through the Alliance, we have mostly grappled since our existence in 2016 about how to answer or communicate the following policy and management questions. So number one, what can be done? Are there global or local solutions to this problem? Is action even possible? Question two, what can be done now versus later? This is a timescale question of understanding the long game and the short game with addressing ocean acidification. Which actors are responsible? Will action help accomplish or enhance existing goals and targets, whether they're individual goals, government goals, institutional goals? And then importantly, is there a template for action? Do we have examples of risk and vulnerability assessments, regional science recommendations, legislation, policy roadmaps, best practices, et cetera? And as we all know, these questions and their answers are very nuanced, as OA is a multi-sectoral, multidiscipline, and even multi-governance issue, touching on many aspects of climate mitigation, adaptation, resilience, food security, ocean, and even land management. And additionally, in the context of climate change, we are increasingly trying to paint the entire picture and making it clear that ocean acidification is driven by anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions and that OA combines with other stressors like warming and reduced oxygen levels, which collectively increase the cumulative stress that marine species and ecosystems are already facing. And it's that these cumulative stressors are also impacting the services, the ecosystem services that humans depend on for our livelihoods, economies, food security, cultural practices, and traditions. And what we found is that by taking this broader lens, we can actually better demonstrate the potential applications of OA information. So through the Alliance, we are really working to show how OA knowledge and information can support or even enhance existing policy priorities and frameworks. So for example, vulnerability assessments, early warning systems and preparedness, fisheries management, habitat restoration and conservation, coral reef health, aquaculture adaptation, nature-based solutions, nutrient runoff, intersections with water quality regulations, and also, importantly, aggressively and urgently reducing CO2 emissions. And by identifying the utility of OA information, we are better positioned to establish calls for action to different audiences. And so I'm not going to read through all these now for time, but I do want to relay that OA information and calls to action are going to be discrete for different purposes, for different actors, and applicable across different scales. And at the Alliance, we've really tried to produce communications tools that speak to and reflect these different calls to action and help reach or even call in to engagement different actors operating at different scales. So for example, here's a quick infographic we did. What can local governments do to address ocean acidification? We've worked on defining the types of OA policymakers across different themes that have most intersection with OA activities. And even international targets that most benefit from increased OA science, policy, and investment. So the themes that we're really going to touch on today is recognizing that increasingly there is no single general audience, that we want to be establishing calls for action or calls to action for different actors. And this is the beginning of that behavior change model. And really the importance of cross-sectoral relationships, iteration, and consistency in that relationship building. So with that framing, it's now my pleasure to turn it over to Juliana Correales, who is our creative consultant here at the OA Alliance, to share her experiences and approach to identifying these calls to action and communication support for OA action taking based upon your experiences, Hula. So over to you. Oh, and unmute, ma'am.
Sorry. So yeah, thanks so much for giving me the space to share my experience working with the Alliance and how we face the challenge of communicating OA and climate ocean change. So as you mentioned, I had the opportunity to participate in COMOTION last November 2022. COMOTION is the main international marine science communication conference. I've seen some names here that we were there together, bringing marine scientists and communicators side by side. The main organizer of the conference is the European Marine Board Communications Panel, supported by IOC UNESCO, as it is part of the UN Decade for Ocean Science. It was very refreshing to be around a group of professionals with one same goal, to bring people closer to the ocean through better communications. Overall, the event was very insightful, despite it not being as diverse as you would expect like an international event should be. I felt that more diversity in country representation and more professionals from communications would have made the conversations richer. But nonetheless, if you move to the next slide, as I said, it is excellent to see how subjects such as communications have been given the importance that they should have when it comes to ocean protection. So here I've brought together the main ideas that stuck with me after the conference. So first of all, define a goal. So when planning a communications plan, why do we do it? Like, what is the overarching goal behind our work as marine science communicators? Then audience, I think audience. I noticed while being there that for us working in communications, it is very obvious how important it is to understand your audience, but not so much for those working in other areas. The most effective communications are demand-driven. So ask yourself, who is my audience? What am I wanting them to do with the information given them? What channels do they use to receive the information, and in what formats? For example, during the conference, we spoke about comic books, dance, games, workshops. Then the narrative, what narrative works best? Up to this point, the narrative around the ocean has been based on the negatives, such as oil spills, tsunamis, plastic, etc. Whilst if you compare it with space or medical science, it's challenging and more spectacular. So we need to desperately change the focus if we want to be heard. And starting to be more solution-driven. So what can I do to make a difference? And last but not least, collaboration. So let's come out of our professional bubbles and make use of the other people's expertise. It was highlighted that it was super beneficial when the scientists worked with the artists or the creatives, and creatives were immersed in both worlds. So during the conference, the EMB presented their new science brief on marine science communication in Europe. I found that despite it being based on surveys made only in that region, there were many valuable insights for all of us working in science communication. So first of all, the main challenge that marine science communicators face is making the invisible visible. So that remoteness and visibility of the marine environment to the rest of the world, which is particularly true when it comes to climate ocean change, which lacks that pretty footage of attractive animals that are easier to relate to. So it requires more creativity and when communicating the issues and science behind it. SciComms also shouldn't feel like an add-on to science. Project proposals should include a pre-planned communication strategy. Some scientists are not aware of the importance of the research leaving their institutes and their networks. There should be more of an institutional culture to promote it and funds to support it. Also, these communication strategies and plans should take into account that the scientists can't be expected to do the research and the communications part. So take into account to outsource some of this work. And most importantly, make sure to have your audience to be part of the process from the beginning till the end. So again, touching on the importance of collaboration and using platforms such as the Decade of Ocean Science to start building these bridges between experts, the importance of cross-sectoral relationships, iteration, and consistency is essential if we want to be successful. And also it highlights the need to show the huge nexus between climate and ocean and of the life of the entire world population. So here we're speaking more about a collective narrative and calls to action. We need to build a collective and agreed message from the OA community of practitioners, which actually takes me to this point that there are many resources out there already made for us when it comes to how to communicate climate ocean change. There is no need to reinvent the wheel. Frameworks in this case, this example is a think tank that helps organizations communicate about social environmental issues to support progressive change. They base their work in rigorous social science methods to come to these sort of conclusions and recommendations. I'm showing you here, as a result of the research, they have created a set of climate reframe cards. So here are two examples of metaphors and ways to communicate how the ocean is related to climate, and the second one on the effects of ocean acidification. These are, of course, general recommendations that can and should be adapted to your audience. But if we have a collective narrative, it will start drilling in people's heads. Then this is the rule of thumb recommended for effective communications as part of the EMB science brief. First of all, get to know your target audiences and their needs. create a communication strategy that involves appropriate vehicles for distributing information based on their needs, and establish those calls to action. And here we introduce another layer that wasn't mentioned before, which is evaluation. So we need to know if our efforts are making a difference. We need to know a before and an after. So create your own metrics of evaluation depending on your project. So now I want to show you how we have navigated what was mentioned before to create a communication strategy for the OA Alliance. So when I came in, we started by outlining the information that we had at hand, but looking at it from a communications perspective, which ended up in the creation of a document that would answer the questions posed here, which is overall, what is the mission and main objectives of the Alliance? Of course, what are the target audiences, the channels, and what actions we wanted these audiences to do. So this document helped us build a strategy and map our strengths, our weaknesses, and opportunities, and how to best to communicate not only our work, but help our members talk about ocean acidification and all of the other climate ocean issues. But most importantly, it showed us the knowledge gaps we had in terms of comms. So were we making assumptions of our audience's needs, and why not just ask them directly? Which is exactly what we did. So we developed a communication survey to hear from our audience and to get to know their perspective on where the OA Alliance can provide most value to them. Here we're showing you a sample of the questions that we got. So we got questions on the level of understanding about OA, barriers to OA action, most interested in communicating about, like issues that people were more interested, so we can guide our product, and what type of content would they like to see on our channels. So at this point, we knew what calls to action we wanted our audiences to take from the first exercise. And thanks to the survey, we heard directly from our audiences their needs and thoughts around these subjects. It was up to us to combine this information into suitable products. So here we have 3 examples. First of all, one of the main objectives of the Alliance is to make it as easy as possible for the members to take climate ocean action. So that's the call to action. The need was lack of time and resources. So it resulted in the creation of a new and rebranded action plan toolkit, easily accessible with all the information in one place. Again, here we were addressing the same call to action, implementing an OA action plan. And however, the need was that members were finding it hard to envision the actual creation of a plan in their context. So they wanted to know how other members had made it. So we created and are still making a set of case studies showing a summary of barriers, opportunities, and creative solutions others have made to inspire action. In this case, we were focusing more on narrative and brand coherence. So it's what I mentioned before. We want all members of the Alliance to share a coherent message. Also, we heard from them that the knowledge around the subject is not too in-depth. So in the communication section of the guidelines, we created messages that would satisfy both our call to actions and the needs. So in our communications plan, we have set ourselves a set of objectives and goals that will help us measure the effectiveness of our communications efforts. Some of them are listed here, but we are still having conversations about how best to measure, one, the impact of our communications activities, and also the cumulative impact of OA actions. So yeah, to conclude, we are aware that we're still just like scratching the surface at the moment. There's so much potential on how to best communicate climate ocean issues. The OA community of practitioners has to come together to make it bigger and clearer. And we are at the OA, we're open for new and more creative collaborations to take this further. So yeah, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Oh, yeah. Thank you so much, Hula, for that presentation and for all of your work to make our messages and strategy around outreach better. As many of you know, Hula joined us around 2020 during pandemic times, and we've been so lucky to have her with us ever since. And I'm sure you've all noticed as members and partners of the Alliance, our look, but also our approach becoming a little bit more streamlined and clear. So thank you, Hula, for joining us and being part of this navigation together, and great presentation. So I think at this point, I will go ahead and ask our panelists to go ahead and turn on your camera and turn on your microphone. And we're just going to use the rest of the time to have a little bit of a discussion. I'll stop sharing here. And I'll change our view in just a second here, but we want to have a little bit of a discussion with some practitioners to hear some of the projects that you're working on. And also I have some questions queued up to sort of probe some of these themes. And then I do encourage everyone to use the chat. I'll do my best to monitor questions at the end. Hopefully we'll have some time for folks listening, but also feel encouraged to use the chat to share resources as you're doing and asking questions. As we know, this is an ongoing process, and we are really not just an emerging field of ocean acidification activities, but also an emerging field then, of course, of the management policy and comms that follow that. So really grateful for the collective brain trust here today. So let me go ahead and choose our video settings so that I'm hiding. Let's see, hide non-video participants, great. And then, yeah, so Nancy, Austin, and Salesa, if you want to go ahead and turn on your camera for us. Great. And Salesa, I don't know if bandwidth will work for camera, but if you're able to turn it on, that would be great. And that will bring you to our forefront here.
Yeah, thank you, Chrissy. I'm at home and it's a bit of rain outside, so if you don't mind with bandwidth, I'll keep my camera off.
No worries. That's great. Well, I'll go ahead and start with you. I'll introduce our panel. So stay with your microphone on, and thank you for being the first to wake up earliest for joining us. So the panel of practitioners we have today includes Mr. Salesa Nime, who is the meteorology lead and climate advisor at SPREP, which is the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program, coordinating environment policy across the 14 Pacific Island countries and territories based out of Samoa. We have Nancy Hotchkiss with us with Pathways Collaborative, working with the state of Oregon on a set of materials that their OA and Hypoxia Coordinating Council have been putting out and thinking about the different comm strategies to share those recommendations with different actors. We have Austin Pugh with the Canadian Community of Practice on Ocean Acidification, working with the federal governments of Canada and the United States on some bilateral communications collaboration around OA research projects. And then Martha Sertula with the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project, who's really been thinking about the overlap between climate change and water quality, or at least coastal terrestrial interactions, and some of the science, but also some of the calls to action associated with that lens. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it to you, Salesa. Again, thank you for joining us early in Apia this morning. I'll just offer and say that SPREP has been working on a project called the New Zealand Pacific Partnership on Ocean Acidification, which included establishing several monitoring sites across the Pacific, and then tying some of those monitoring, the information to various adaptation and resiliency strategies across the Pacific when it comes to ocean acidification. One of the things that we've talked about, Salesa, through your membership and leadership in the Alliance is the importance of integrating OA activities across mainstream policies. And so from your perspective in the Pacific, can you just share some of the main areas of policy focus that you are charged with shepherding, and how you think about the OA work needing to be tied to those larger policy goals? And then I'll ask you about the barriers to some of that work, but I'll turn it over to you first to talk about the policy focus.
Thank you, Jesse, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to join this this panel. As you know, for us in the Pacific, ocean is a really big deal for us. We live, breathe, and do everything with the ocean. And so there's been a lot of there's been a few efforts over the years to try and bring the ocean discussion to the forefront. Recently, just last year, the Pacific leaders endorsed the 2050 strategy for a blue Pacific continent, and that's recognizing that while we are small island nations, we are a big blue continent that and majority of our area are ocean. And so there are several other policies that will be linking to the larger roadmap. In terms of ocean acidification and the discussion around climate change, we know that during the COP23, Fiji, as the presidency of the COP, have pushed the issue of ocean to be part of the UNFCCC discussion, not only for us to discuss climate, but also recognizing that ocean is also equally important and will be impacted by climate change, and that there needs to be equal focus on ocean as we are doing on climate. And so that discussion to date is still an ongoing one, and we are hoping for, we are pushing for the COP process, the UNFCCC process to include the ocean as part of the overall UNFCCC discussion. Last year, we set up a committee to organize ourselves in the Pacific on how to push this. This year, we are hopefully developing a paper for the COP, for the Pacific leaders, to try and look at how we finance ocean and climate change, the discussion to try and move us closer towards getting this to be part of the overall discussion. So when we talk about ocean, the ocean and climate change discussion, it covers all of the issues that climate change affects, and that also includes ocean acidification. There are several issues that we're struggling with and trying to make our policymakers at the national level, as well as community leaders, to be aware of who utilizes the ocean on a day-to-day basis. And I totally agree with previous presentation on communication, because that is one of the biggest challenges that we face. When we translate these terms into local languages, we don't have any terms for describing ocean acidification. The best we can do in many languages is to say the ocean will become saltier, because there is no term to describe acidification in any of our languages. And so when we describe ocean acidification, ocean issues for us, there is marine heat waves. That is also equally important. We have sea level rise, which usually comes to the top of the discussion given the nature and geography of our island. And so developing, information packages and communication packages, such as the one that was described in the earlier presentation, are very important. We have worked with, with yourself, Jesse, and the Ocean Acidification Alliance to develop policy guidance to help our member countries on how to do the integration of ocean acidification into national policies, and this overall discussion on climate change and the ocean impact. But that I would say at the moment it's something that is being discussed. In our project, we're trying to demonstrate how the adaptation component of ocean acidification can be introduced. But I think in this in this type of discussion and meeting and conferences, it is important to note that when we discuss about solutions for ocean acidification, for us in the Pacific, and when we're dealing with our communities, we look to community-based solutions rather than high-tech solutions which we cannot get our communities to adopt and to be able to look. Monitoring is very important to create awareness that ocean acidification is not a global issue, but it's happening at your doorstep, and having those local monitoring stations help to create awareness and to be able for communities to see that this is happening to them. It's not an issue that it's happening on paper only. Yeah, I think that's really important. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Salesa. That's a great overview, both from your perspective and your work in SPREP and sort of what the discussions are around the different caucuses, if you will, of Pacific leadership, but also at scales, right? So you mentioned the UNFCCC, for those on making sure UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, as sort of one level of that international policy landscape, the medium level being that national government policy integration, policy guidance on where national ocean policies, climate adaptation strategies are reflecting the ocean components, as you mentioned, and sort of how you share OA as relevant to or connected to marine heat waves, sea level rise, et cetera. But then at that local level, I loved your term community-based solutions, with kind of similar and somewhat different than nature-based solutions, but I think along the same lines, and really appreciate your point about language. And so I'll just note for those of you, we can send around a link. SPREP has been leading on some of the ocean acidification posters, I believe, in, was it Fiji, Vanuatu, and Kiribati? Looking at translating just the term ocean acidification into something a little bit more from a local language perspective. And so I think that's really, really great offering and thinking about communications at different levels for different purposes and sort of how we're placing the OA narrative at those scales, and that we can't ignore any of them because they do sort of all work together and reinforce each other. So thank you so much, Salesa. If you'll stay, if you're able to, for questions at the end, I'll turn it back to you, but that's a great suggestion or great layering of the landscape, and we can send links around for what you've referenced. Taking it now a little bit back to a local scale, I'll be excited now to hear from you, Nancy, from Pathways Collaborative. You've been working, so you are not with the state of Oregon, you're not a government partner, but you're a communications partner, and you've been brought on to work with the state of Oregon as they are thinking about how best to share out their state level OA and hypoxia recommendations that they've been formulating over the last several years. And so I'm just curious if you can give us, I have questions in two parts. The first is, if you can just give us an overview of what that comms project was commissioned to look like. What was that scope of work? What did this group come to you and say their goals were? And why was it important to inject sort of some extra comms support? And then I'll go to a second question about some of your methods and terms.
Okay, thanks. I've got to tell you, this is really, really great. I love being in a room full of, a virtual room of people that really care about this. Yeah, we were hired to come in, and I've got to give big props to the state of Oregon. The governor set aside $1 million for, I think, 6 different research projects to support ocean acidification research, and then a comms project. So yay, Juliana, they thought of comms. Then we were asked to develop a messaging campaign and a communications toolkit that will inspire, and they put in here key audiences, not every single person, to act to reduce the projected trajectory of ocean and climate change. The deliverables that we have been working on, we're prioritizing actions and audiences. We have the creation of a toolkit, and I'm already seeing a bazillion things from various organizations represented here, where I will probably be reaching out and going, best hits, we need this, because toolkits need to show the best of what it is. We don't have to reinvent it. And then an implementation and rollout plan. We have a number of different partners in this. There's Pathways Collaborative. We also have the Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Council. And within that council, they also have an education outreach group. And we are looking at additional community partners who are people that are kind of on the periphery, but are very, very interested. And part of our strategy is to create essentially community messengers out of those folks, giving them the tools they need to go out to the groups that they deal with. I will stop, Jesse.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Thank you so much. So following up, I want to, we all have this hard task of thinking about, we have all these science recommendations, right? And we want more energy, effort, awareness, appreciation, funding for that work. And we're trying to place that work in various contexts. And as you said, you kind of were brought in to identify key audiences. So can you give us just an overview of the methods that you sort of said, well, how are we going to identify key audiences with these sort of calls for action, what those metrics might be? So how did you what was the method for saying who are our key audiences?
Sure. We started with, first of all, we did front end surveys with the council and that extended audience of folks that are already in the field, already involved in this, to ask them to actually visualize kind of 5 years down the road, what would success look like? And then who would be the partners that would make this happen? And I will say it was kind of, we had to pull a little bit out of folks because it's not an easy solution. You can't just point at one audience and say, those guys, they'll solve it. You have to try and figure out who in your community has a role in this. So we also did a bit of a survey, created this giant spreadsheet of all the different types of audiences, and then had them do some ranking, which was very hard because we all like to try and include everyone. We're like, but you can't just shove them all under the umbrella. You really have to try and define. So with this project, we have managed to narrow it down to 4 target audiences. Local governmental folks that are in charge of port and county commissioners. In Oregon, those are very important people. Our second audience is basically commercial fisheries, the harvest industry, the folks that are out on the water all the day. Third is seafood suppliers and their link to restaurants, because that is then taking your seafood into the public realm. And then the fourth part really is, it's down a little bit lower, but tourism and hospitality. In Oregon, on the coast, that is growing so much. And there is an opportunity to make that a green hospitality industry, very, very focused on environmental resilience. So those were the 4 big audiences that we are focusing on. Right now, we're at the stage of defining what are the outcomes you want those audiences to do. And then backwards from that, you then create the messages to get to those outcomes, to get to those audiences. It's a little bit of a reverse for many of the scientists that we're working with, because the scientific method is, here's a question, let's just keep, sorry, my dog decided to wake up. What are the ways we can figure this one out? And we're saying, nope, I need you to set the goal. Then let's go down and go down and go down and figure it that way.
Great context and overview. So appreciate that. And I'm going to circle back. I mean, the notion of prioritization and ranking, I mean, I think that's the hardest thing, because we say, well, we have all these different pieces of the puzzle and we can do all of them equally well at the same time. And the answer is just like in light, I've been sort of thinking about from a climate change perspective, it's like we're past the point that we're getting A+ in all categories, right? So where are we starting to think about where we need to prioritize our efforts? What is, again, at this scale, what can we do today? What can we do in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? And sort of how do we start to build out that discussion around actions, actors, and messages? So I think that's great. One more question to you, and then I'll move into that, keeping with the prioritization theme, over to you, Austin. But Nancy, I'm curious, we've talked a lot about, calls to action, behavior change, is sort of where we want to be going. And I know that you grappled with this and are grappling with this in Oregon, and sort of this, what do we want them to be doing? You're still charting out the specifics, but one thing that you've kind of circled on is this notion of a civic readiness factor. Can you just talk a little bit about what that has meant and sort of how that has been described in discussion of what you're trying to curate?
Sure. Yeah, and it is very hard. And it's very hard with a lot of environmental action to say, what specifically do you want me to do? Because and you and I had this conversation, awareness isn't enough. Awareness does not necessarily move you to make some changes. So in absence of very specific legislation or policy pieces that you want people to respond to, we've landed on the concept of civic readiness, and I will share with you our definition, that we want our audiences, those key audiences, as well as the messengers who are going out to do this, to possess the skills and fierce desire, we chose those words, fierce desire to respond to calls for action or legislation or funding on the local, community, county, and state level. So there may be opportunities for different audiences in different ways. We want them to feel ready. You know, it's kind of like you want to get everybody to be like, all the folks on this call, we are ready for that action. Once you tell me what it is, I will run off and do it.
Mhm. That's great. And we'll ask you to share some of those resources as they are available. And obviously through the Alliance, we'll continue to share out. But thank you so much. It was great chatting with you and sort of thinking about grappling with these questions of what are we actually trying to accomplish with these recommendations, and which actors do we need to call in, and how do we need to prepare them to be ready? I think that's such a great way to think about it. So Austin, over to you, and sort of keeping with this theme of prioritization, which I think is interesting. You obviously are the lead coordinator for the Canadian Community of Practice on Ocean Acidification. Can you tell us a little bit about what there, within that framework, the federal governments of Canada under Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada and the US NOAA have a bilateral ocean acidification program and have had a project overlap for several years. And this year there is a really increased emphasis on the need to communicate about what that work is in context. And so can you describe why it was sort of discussed that communication should be put forward at this time, and some of the, the significance of the research projects that you're trying to highlight. So just kind of give us that overview, and then we'll talk about audiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jesse, and thank you everyone else for being here today. So just a little bit of background really quick. The DFO NOAA OA collaboration is a collaboration that's existed for, I think, about 6 years now. And the idea is that the ocean doesn't care about the border, and there's a lot of shared interests between the DFO interest in ocean acidification and the NOAA interest in ocean acidification. And what happened with this group is they were producing these collaborative projects between the DFO and NOAA, both within Canada, in the States, and across the border, that handled the issues of interest. But what they discovered was they were beginning to become siloed within their own group, and the communication to even other scientists within the field of ocean acidification, they weren't necessarily hearing about these amazing projects that aren't only exciting and possible between government agencies, but they're also vital to the future of ocean acidification research. So in the last meeting in November, it was decided that communication would play a big role moving forward, as there was all of these projects that they have a backlog of that they want to make sure are in the hands of the people that can use them and will be able to bring them into their work moving into the future. So that's where the priority came from, with an emphasis on communication, is taking the work that has been done and is currently going on and bringing it to not only other people in the field, but potentially end users down the line.
That's great. And I appreciate that context, Austin, because I agree. I mean, even, we're talking about communicating OA science and information to policymakers and users, decision makers, stakeholders, community members, fill in the blank. But I think we often don't talk as much about communicating from science community to science community. As we've talked about, OA is a multi-sectoral, multidiscipline issue. And so you've got lots of people from different fields of oceanography, biology, chemistry, needing to come together and sort of think about how these research projects fit together, both so that there's information sharing and there's awareness, but also from my perspective, so that there's sort of this cumulative build on how this work is informing discrete decisions, discrete narratives, even about a different region or a different location. So I think that's an interesting take on the ocean acidification audience, sort of like to each other as scientists and researchers to some extent. So can you just describe it? I think we've talked a bit about this, but who are some of the core audiences that you guys have been thinking about trying to reach and receive information about these particular research projects? And importantly, how are you trying to describe the significance of the research? You know, how are you trying to say this research is important for blah, blah, blah? And how does that map to your audiences?
Absolutely. So as I already mentioned, one of our main audiences is other scientists, but we also have a large focus on early career professionals. In the past year has been a shifting focus over towards early career professionals due to the knowledge sharing capacity that they can provide. They bring other skills to the table, and getting early career professionals in the room with well-established professionals can really change the conversation and bring tools to the table that are a big benefit. So that's been a really big focus of not only the communication plan, but also the DFO NOAA OA collaboration as a whole. We also try and engage with national and international groups that handle ocean acidification. And one of the reasons for this is the communications project isn't huge, and we don't have the capacity to start at, ground zero and try and build up these communication networks. As it's been already said, we don't want to try and reinvent the wheel, especially when these communication networks are already in place, such as the OA community of practice in Canada. We have an extensive network across Canada already. It would be almost silly to ignore that and try and build one that already exists. And then we're engaging with groups like the OA Alliance to help promote the highlights that we feature of the projects coming out of the OA collaboration beyond Canada into the United States and globally. And then the final group that we are trying to engage, however, we don't necessarily have the capacity to do it at a super specific level, are coastal communities. And the way that we're targeting all these groups, despite not having this huge team creating resources, is creating summary cards of specific projects that are coming out of the OA collaboration. And we're approaching it in two ways on the summary card. There are the main takeaways, the big takeaways, and what this project will accomplish. The big takeaways frame the outcomes of each project in a real world setting. So how does it affect and how does it impact fishermen? How does it impact a community in a specific area? Whereas what the project will accomplish is more technical, field specific. It explores what new techniques is this project targeting, what research is it building on, and potential future implications that are more field specific. Yet the language we're using for both, we try and keep fairly general and leave the jargon out to ensure that anyone can understand it. I know when I make a card, I usually put it by one of my friends that isn't in the OA space, just so that to see if I'm communicating effectively. And that is one of our main methods of highlighting the projects that are coming out of this collaboration.
That's great. Thanks, Austin, and excited to continue to share out the comms products that you'll be putting out and share that out with our Alliance members as well. I only laugh and raise my hand that I've quickly realized that my lack of being an OA scientist or OA practitioner was, I mentally changed it from a negative to a positive when I realized that I'm the lens and screen by which if I understand it, then we're good. And if I don't, then we're not. And that was a helpful way to think about running this work by kind of folks outside our more technical communities. So I think that's great. So thank you so much. And now turning it over to Dr. Martha Satula, last but certainly not least. Now we're going to bring it down. We have different scales of the national, state, kind of bilateral. And now I really want to hone into some of that local nexus where sort of the terrestrial, coastal, climate start to intersect. And just broadly, can you just describe for us, I think this is going to be a more kind of a new subject to probably more folks on the line. Why would a group like the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project be interested in understanding the impacts of climate change and anthropogenic pollution on coastal acidification, hypoxia, and harmful algal blooms? Or rather, why are you thinking about ocean acidification in this local context and in also this global climate context? Give us a little more context for the project.
Sure, great. So first of all, that long name for my institution is, we're actually a research institute. And I think the way that I like to talk about what my research institute's vision is essentially to really support and participate in science, but also bring that science to coastal resource managers, whether water quality or marine resources, and actually help them utilize that science to essentially improve how they're managing those resources. And so my institute became interested in the topic of OA, understanding that this is essentially bringing a major sort of challenge and threat to our coastal water quality. And in working with those managers, I'm a research scientist, but in working with those managers, I think it's a really important context that at least in the United States, the mandate for water quality protection is essentially three pieces. It's the chemistry, it's the biology, and the physical integrity of these systems. And so ultimately, this is clearly a problem with respect to changing chemistry, and it's most definitely challenging essentially the integrity of our coastal ecosystems. And so water quality managers want to know, is there anything that we can do on a local level to really help to buy time, to help increase the resilience of our coastal ecosystems in the threat of essentially what is a global driver for climate change.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to ask just a general question following from that, and just to be organic and honest, I always struggle through the Alliance to sort of say, what can we do? Ocean acidification is number one cause is, atmospheric anthropogenic CO2 carbon emissions. And the number one thing we can do to mitigate ocean acidification is to reduce CO2 emissions. That's the top line message. And that there are things governments can and should be doing now, to build out adaptation, to prioritize and build out adaptation and resilience strategies at local and national and local scales. And one of those things, quickly becomes thinking about that terrestrial influence and the, runoff of pollution, of nutrients, of wastewater, of stormwater, agriculture, runoff that starts to exacerbate that coastal space. And starts to become, create hotspots or less habitable conditions. It's also a place that you have more potential regulation control at the local level. As Nancy was mentioning, one of the primary audiences that the state of Oregon was looking at are port and county commissioners. That's super local, super almost terrestrial, kind of focused in nature. And I've wonder and hold it in my own brain, is there a tension between saying, we have this, global trend that we know we need to reduce, and we're all taking actions in different ways and scales to reduce CO2. And here's this local terrestrial thing we can be measuring and evaluating and reducing stress here. Do you find tension in those two messages, or do you find are those complementary, or sort of how do you think about the message of those sort of overlapping roles and spheres?
Well, so I find, at least as a scientist working in this space with coastal water quality managers, I find that the idea that we can actually have some sort of impact locally to be very empowering. I think that when we begin to evaluate some of the potential options or solutions, what people really realize is that they can have a very strong role in protecting their local ecosystems. And it becomes, I think, a rallying point. Even for students that I work with, this gives them hope for what otherwise sometimes people don't feel like they have a lot of control over. And so ultimately, for coastal water quality managers, they typically want to know three things. How, essentially, what is the problem and how bad is it? And I think the OA community is really doing a great job working on that. The second thing they want to know is, how is that phenomena connected to what I'm doing locally, or what I have control over locally, whether it's water discharges or even restoration of an estuarine, of some estuary. And then the third thing they want to know is, if I actually do some sort of management action, how much is that going to buy us? How much time will it buy us? What's the context for that relative to the scale of changes that we're seeing or that are coming towards us? And I think that, whether you're a county commissioner or a water quality manager, I think that those are the types of things that people are generally concerned about, especially as we think about investing hard-earned resources in turning and dialing knobs. What, how much time are we buying? What scale of relief are we likely to achieve?
Great. Thanks so much for that, Martha. And I think that's perfectly sort of tailors or mirrors, I suppose, some of these themes and the introduction, and sort of how we're trying to think about different scale and messages, in the long term, medium and short term, we need to be reducing CO2 emissions. And there's lots of different actors and methods for doing that. And then, how is that connected to what we can control now, in a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 year time scale at the local level? And then what does that do? What does that buy us? And that's all based upon our priorities, right? Which resources are in the area that we care most about and why? And so I think that's really sort of an important way that we've tried to scaffold some helpful guiding questions around not just what's possible when it comes to mitigating, adapting to ocean acidification, but also the comms that we need to reach the different practitioners, the different resource managers, the different stakeholders, industry partners, to help us think about what can we do now at local scales and how do we prioritize? And I think that's really sort of what our comms focus has tried to guide our membership towards, but also collaborate with and co-design all of these types of efforts. So with that, I'll say, we're right at time. I see Quinquet on the line. I'll for those that are able to stay on and have a little bit of call and response and some questions, we'll maybe go about 10 more minutes for those that want to do that. I'll also keep the chat open for a bit. So if you have links that you want to copy your import into your own lives, you are invited to do that. And of course, we'll post the recording of this and maybe even a little Q&A with panelists in more detail after. But thank you so much for joining today. Really good discussion. Quinquet, over to you.
Peace and blessings all. Happy Black History Month. Good to see you again, Jesse. It seems like it's every week now. I had a question, and it's so perfect because the last presenter, the doctor, landed right on what I wanted to ask. Being that I live on the Sea Islands here in the Gullah Geechee Nation, literally in the Atlantic Ocean. Of course, we deal with estuaries on one side, ocean on the other side of the island. So one of the things we're doing is the South Atlantic Salt Marsh Initiative. And a question I had today, literally this morning, just a couple of hours ago, was what is a good way to communicate how salt marsh is a carbon store? How does that help us in this OA world and the work that we're doing in regard to salt marsh and what it does to help us kind of as a preventative measure? I would love it if any of the panelists could answer that in a way that the layperson can understand, not just the way that all of us techno-speak scientists understand. I would love to know that. Even if someone could email that to me, that would be great. And I'll drop my email in the chat. Thank you so much, Jesse, for noticing the raise hand right at the time you're leaving out. So thank you. This was great.
Thank you for joining. Good question. Martha, do you want to take I have a Jesse answer to that, but I'll kick it to you if you have a Martha answer to that.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I'm the expert in communication, especially to lay audiences. But I think that really, if there are I really do feel like there are a lot of great resources for communicating what are the role of wetlands in our ecosystems. And I think we should lean back on that and try to find you some good infographics that help to communicate in very simple ways the power of wetlands to store carbon. They're essentially pulling that carbon out of the atmosphere and holding on to it. And the other beautiful things that wetlands do too, they also purify your water, and they essentially provide really important habitat and refugia for the critters that we care about. And so
Martha freeze for everybody. She froze for me.
Yeah, I think so.
I got you, Martha.
Good. Well, so I would say there's probably communication experts that could answer that question a bit better, but I think we
Yeah,
can find some good sources.
some infographics. Yeah, right after you said the
Yeah.
infographics, then you froze. So yeah, I'm gonna drop my email in the chat, and if you could send me, anybody can send me those types of infographics, that would be outstanding. I
Sure.
appreciate it.
Thanks, Quinquet. And I'll add my, Nancy, I see you. I'll turn to you. I'll add my quick Jesse comment on that is we are going to create an infographic about, we talked a lot about nature-based solutions for ocean acidification. And one thing that we've always tried to really communicate through the Alliance, and Hula and I will be working on this year with some comms messages and some infographics, and many other partners working in coastal wetlands have great ones as well, is that kind of back to what Martha was saying, the buying time message. Some coastal ecosystems and wetlands can help us sequester carbon, store and sequester carbon. That's our blue carbon, right? We are contributing to carbon drawdown sequestration. In addition, and not limited to blue carbon, a lot of these ecosystems provide co-benefits and help remediate the local impacts of ocean acidification. And we have a lot more research ongoing to think about how kelp, salt marsh, mangroves, eelgrass can provide a halo or a buffering effect because they're actually taking up carbon in the water column nearby. That's all variable based upon season and type of ecosystem and location. But largely there's a narrative that these are co-benefiting calcifying organisms that are nearby, like oysters, mussels, coral even. And so the more that we can say, not only is this a blue carbon, we've got some good infographics already in the chat going, not only is this a blue carbon potential, but even if you don't meet the criteria for blue carbon for evaluating and measuring that in the pretty specific way that governments are needing to do that, we can still point to the research that's saying this is co-beneficial for remediating those local stressors of ocean acidification. And that's good for these nearby resources for these reasons. So I think that's sort of where we want to go with that both and message of the mitigation and the adaptation resiliency, and that our coastal wetlands, our marine ecosystems are critical in both of those categories at different rates, of course, but that's a big message for us. Nancy, I didn't want to cut you off. Over to you.
It's okay. I just wanted to add, one of the things that Frameworks, who I've done a lot of work with because I worked with the NOCI project, National Network of Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation. If you get a chance to see their materials, one of the things they recommend for communication is to tap into people's values. And one of the values that really, really gets to people is responsible management looking towards the future. So people, I am assuming, on an island, we have an incredible sense of place, an incredible sense of community. So it's how am I helping to save responsibly my home? So it's kind of just a way to get your communication out. And I can, I see Juliana's on too about the NOCI project. We can drop that into the chat for you to look at all of their tools. They're available and it's wonderful. And you can do training online to learn some of these methodologies.
Great. Well, thank you so much to everyone. Hula, I'm going to give you a heads up right now that I was going to give you the last word, anything that you want to add for the good of the order. I'll just say before we all hang up, thank you so much for joining. All of you on the line are active partners in the Alliance, participants in this work. We are doing it together as we go. We've heard that we don't really need to reinvent the wheel in some aspects, and yet we are fully defining the road in others when it comes to OA information for different purposes and how we're calling in different actors to help us do that and apply that and message that. So we will follow up with this recording. We'll follow up with some more materials. And just really appreciate the ongoing partnerships and collaborations to continue to co-design these types of messages and these types of products and share what already exists out there for different scales, global, national, local, regional. Hula, you are our commander-in-chief when it comes to comms. Anything that you want to add or reflect on the discussion today, or sort of what we're excited to be doing going forward?
Yeah, so one thing I want to say is about like these questions, like how do I communicate this? And usually the answers are in the people, in your audience. So like values, yeah, exactly, like knowing why that ecosystem is important to them will give you the answer and how to communicate it, because we know all the technicalities sometimes on the like scientific part, but then usually all the answers are there. And usually just having conversations, or especially if you're in a community, if you can go and talk to the people you want to reach, talk to them, I think that's super valuable for me. Just having face-to-face, any sort of channel of communication with your audience will make the whole process easier. And yeah, no, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for all the comments and everything. The chat has been super active.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Hula. And again, we'll continue to sort of work together, and even thinking about, are there methods or, best practices for even that audience engagement? Like Nancy, I'm really keen to sort of report out the Oregon process. I think it will be a good one for others to sort of look to and say, a lot of places have these discrete OA recommendations at this point. How do we do, as Hula was saying, some survey, reaching out to the audiences that we're trying to engage, and what did that process look like, and what were the kind of standard approaches to that? Of course, for adapting at local levels, but I think that'll be useful. Austin similarly, and then Martha, a whole new frontier when it comes to water quality practitioners, and meeting them where they are at and engaging them in this work, which we'll do more of through the Alliance and through the UN Decade, I think, together. So watch this space. Thanks for everyone. I'll turn off my camera. I'll keep the chat open for a little bit just so you can continue to chat or pick up links, and then I'll close it out maybe 15 minutes past. But thanks so much for your time, and look forward to working with you this year.